land. It would take you a week to do an acre.
He's got problems. He's a lousy governor. So I said, Gavin, will you sign it?
Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on California fires and the consequences of overregulation. We have a lot of members that will be waving on today. Without objection, Mr. McClintock, Mr. Kiley, Mr. Biggs, Mr. Liu, Mr. Swalwell, Ms. Kamler Dove, and Mr. Moskowitz will be permitted to participate in today's hearing for the purposes of questioning the witnesses. If a member yields them time for that purpose, I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Earlier this year, Southern California was hit with tragedy as fires, exacerbated by strong Santa Ana winds, engulfed large sections of Los Angeles. California Department of Forestry and Fire Management reports that the ongoing wildfires have burned more than 57,000 acres, destroyed 16,000 structures, and tragically caused the death of 28 individuals. These fires are not a new occurrence. Wildfires have been plaguing Southern California for hundreds of years. An abundant forest and shrubland, coupled with a relatively dry climate and strong coastal winds, increase the risk and prevalence of fires. Given the heightened threat environment, one would think California would prioritize mitigation efforts to reduce the number and the strength of fires. Unfortunately, California leaders have insisted and instead prioritized often counterproductive goals like planting trees, installing electric vehicle charging stations, over-equipping their communities and first responders with the tools they need to protect their citizens and livelihoods. And unfortunately, this thinking has resulted in decades of overregulation that have left Californians more vulnerable to wildfires. For example, the state's increase of lawsuits brought by environmental groups under the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA, has delayed proper forest management projects, such as controlled burns, timber harvesting, or brush clearing. It has also given rise to sue and settle litigation where environmental activists sue regulators for the purposes of imposing a friendly settlement agreement. Meanwhile, the California Coastal Commission has near dictatorial powers to approve or deny any project along the 840-mile coastline. This muscle was flexed in 2019 when the LA Department of Water and Power attempted to replace wooden power lines in the Pacific Palisades area with steel. They also tried to widen fire lanes and install fire-resistant power lines. But the Coastal Commission put the project to a halt and ordered Water and Power to pay a nearly $2 million fine due to the discovery of an endangered plant in the vicinity of the project. Governor Newsom rightfully waived the requirements of the CEQA and the Coastal Act to spare fire victims the burdensome permitting and review requirements as they rebuild their homes. Well, waiving the requirements exposes the very cumbersome nature of these regulations. Contributing to this crisis is the elected California State Insurance Commissioner, who routinely has chosen to put artificial price caps on insurance rates. This has led to decades of stagnant insurance premiums as they're an obvious political incentive to oppose rate hikes, and has caused insurers to pause issuing new policies or leave the state entirely. It has also caused more reliance on the state's insurers of last resort, the California Fair Plan. According to the LA Times, and insurance companies that are leaving the state, and the Fair Plan has been seen as a policy that could count and grow for as little as 200,000 in 2020 to more than 450,000 as of September 2024. Taken together, these regulations have fueled the frequency and strength of wildfires in California. State and local leaders have also deprioritized fire prevention in their budgets. LA Mayor Karen Bass, for example, approved a budget for 2024 that cut more than $17 million from the LA Fire Department. Governor Newsom similarly reduced funding for numerous fire safety and prevention programs in the state budget, including $101 million reduction for wildfire and fire resilient programs. I'm sure you can buy a lot of EV charging stations for $100 million. Today, we will hear from a panel of experts who have been preaching for years to stop appeasing the environmental activists and begin implementing adequate water and forest management policies. It's It's my hope that these witnesses will be prepared to offer recommendations that state and federal lawmakers may use to protect California from future fires. Absent real regulatory reform in the state, I fear history is tragically bound to repeat itself. I now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Nadler for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to congratulate you on becoming chair of the subcommittee. While I am sure that we will have many disagreements, beginning with today's hearing, I do look forward to working with you and to finding areas of common ground. Mr. Chairman, while tens of thousands of Californians are still reeling from the fires that forced them to evacuate and that destroyed their homes and their livelihoods, Republicans are exploiting this crisis with a hearing that does nothing more than provide a sad excuse to further their long-held goal of dismantling the regulations that keep us safe. Rather than face the undeniable facts of climate change and the need for urgent, unfettered federal assistance to help Californians rebuild their lives, Republicans want to change the subject. But we should begin by remembering the tens of thousands of people whose lives have been upended by this disaster.
If you look back in the history of California, for me, this is comparable to the 1906 earthquake in California. And the level of catastrophe and disaster here is high. And there's one reason that we're seeing a fire this ferocious. It's the weather, and the number one piece in the weather is the wind.
Anthony Maroney is chief of the LA County Fire Department, one of the officials overseeing the firefight. He told us the devil winds hurled embers far ahead of the fire, like snowfall from hell.
Made louder. The devastation wrought by these fires is unimaginable, and the only question we should be asking now is how we can help the people of California recover. And despite the heroism of first responders and plentiful water access, all but one small reservoir closed for maintenance, the fires tragically destroyed acres upon acres of homes and communities. Instead of responding to this tragedy with open hearts, Republicans, led by President Trump and his unelected co-president Elon Musk, have resorted to a flurry of baseless accusations and scurrilous misinformation seeking to blame California's Democratic elected officials. And when they claim to be helping the situation, they've actually done more harm than good. For example, President Trump has falsely argued that environmental protection policies left Southern California without sufficient water to fight the wildfires, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Nevertheless, he ordered the release of over 2 billion gallons of water in the Central Valley, purportedly to support his unsubstantiated claims. The president claimed that the water was, quote, heading to farmers throughout the state and to Los Angeles. This critical agricultural resource, desperately needed by California's farmers for the spring, was instead, due to the president's actions, diverted into the Pacific Ocean, 100 miles away from Los Angeles. California does not need political photo ops that waste desperately needed water. They need real federal assistance. And how does the president respond? By insisting that any federal aid come with strings attached that further his own political agenda, like voter ID laws. Never mind that California already has voter ID laws, but the president wants to play politics rather than help those in need.
And Gavin Newsom is going to sign those papers. And if he doesn't sign those papers, we won't give him money to put out all his fires. And if we don't give him the money to put out his fires, he's got problems. He's a lousy governor. So I said, Gavin, will you sign? It took him like a month and a half or 2 months, and then he decided for political reasons. And then we got hit with COVID, and we had to solve another problem.
That is outrageous. And it is outrageous that Republicans in Congress, including Speaker Johnson, have indicated that they are open to placing conditions on disaster aid, especially ones that have nothing to do with wildfires. Not only is that wrong for California, but it is simply wrong to treat the citizens of any state as pawns in a political game. Natural disasters tragically affect millions of Americans across the country each year. As FEMA's website explains, its purpose is, quote, to help people before, during, and after disasters, unquote. To help people, all people. It is not there to help just the Republicans or just the Democrats or to promote partisan objectives. It has always been and should always remain strictly neutral in its work. Members should be careful before they consider attaching political strings to the federal funds needed to recover from natural disasters. If it can happen to California, it can happen to your state too. In 2024 alone, the states my colleagues across the aisle represent collectively had 122 extreme weather events that necessitated FEMA assistance. 122 extreme weather events made worse and made more frequent by the realities of climate change that the majority still will not acknowledge. Imagine if then President Biden had conditioned necessary FEMA disaster recovery funds on strings that bear no relation to the disasters their constituents are still recovering from. They would have been outraged, justifiably. But today, they remain silent. And today, instead of letting California recover from the blazes that were contained only 5 days ago, and to take stock of how to rebuild, the majority is leveraging the pain and suffering of Americans to push a message of deregulation over all else. Instead of supporting our fellow Americans as they pick up the pieces, instead of ensuring that our neighbors have the resources they need to recover from this disaster, instead of working to slow the devastating effects of climate change that affect us all, Republicans will return to their tired old playbook and blame everything on overregulation. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Frank Falt, a retired fire chief with actual experience on the ground fighting fires and saving lives. I'm looking forward to hearing from a true expert on how we can best help California in its hour of need. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member started off his comments by saying that Republicans wanted to dismantle the regulations that keep us safe. That keep us safe. 28 Californians lost their lives. 20,000 structures were destroyed. 40,000 acres where these fires took place. And California is the most heavily regulated state in the country. We're trying to figure out how we can stop this. It's not about dismantling regulations. If regulations were going to solve the problem, they'd have been solved. Everything would have been solved in California because you got regulations more than any other place. So I appreciate the chairman bringing experts in here to tell us what's really going on. Appreciate this hearing. And oh, to be clear, the clip that was shown by Ranking Member Nadler of President Trump was before the fires. It was clear back in September, for goodness sake. So we're going to get to the truth with our witnesses. I want to thank the chairman for this important hearing about regulatory reform that really needs to happen. And we want to make sure the regulations are in California don't come to the rest of the country, because we don't want this happening all over our great nation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are fortunate to have with us today witnesses who know as well as anyone what has gone so wrong in my state, what has gone so wrong in the Golden State. They will share with us the titanic policy blunders and staggering failures of political leadership that have caused such harm to California and for which our citizens have paid such a high price. I believe that today's hearing can be a moment where we turn the tide and restore some sanity to California fire and water policy while issuing a warning to the rest of the country about the devastating consequences of these failed policies. As President Trump said, there can be no golden age without the Golden State. Our first witness is Steve Hilton. Now, most probably know Mr. Hilton as a British and American commentator for, among other outlets, Fox News. But he actually, back in 2010 to 2012, was the director of strategy for British Prime Minister David Cameron. And he has now brought his unique mix of brilliant strategy, passion, and a common sense approach to policy to found a nonprofit organization called Golden Together, which focuses on fixing the problems that are causing a mass exodus of people from the state of California. That mass exodus, by the way, is measurable. For 5 straight years, California has ranked #1 in the country in outbound U-Haul rentals. The greatest state in the country, most beautiful state in the country, has become the most popular state to leave. Mr. Hilton's testimony will cover the failures in leadership that have led to the lack of preparation for the fires in Los Angeles. Our second witness is someone who many of us in California know very well and whose insights we have been relying on for a long time. Mr. Stephen Greenhut is Resident Senior Fellow and Western Region Director for State Affairs at R Street Institute. He was a columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune who focused on California policy and state government. He authored the book, Winning the Water Wars: California Can Meet Its Water Needs by Promoting Abundance Rather Than Managing Scarcity. His testimony will identify many areas in which policy promises in California that were made with no follow-through from California leaders. As a California resident, he can speak to the personal impact many of these policy decisions have had on him and his family. And finally, Mr. Edward Ring, who is perhaps as knowledgeable about water and fire policy in California as just about anyone. Dr. Ring is the Director of Water and Energy Policy for the California Policy Center. He has a deep tactical knowledge of the poor decision-making of environmentalist California policymakers. He will speak directly to the prolonged environmental review process and the meddling of environmental groups that prevents proper fire mitigation and water management from happening in California. And lest anyone think that the purpose of this hearing is simply to identify problems rather than present solutions, I'd encourage you to check out Dr. Ring's written testimony in which he has literally dozens and dozens of concrete policy changes that California could make right now to improve the situation. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this important hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, to introduce the Democrat witness.
Thank you. Before I introduce our witness, I must take strong exception to what Mr. Kiley said when he said California was the most beautiful state in the Union. Obviously, New York is the most beautiful state in the Union. Chief Frevo has served since 1979 with special district, city, county, state, and federal fire agencies in roles from firefighter to fire chief. He holds an MS from Oklahoma State University in Fire and Emergency Management Administration and currently serves as the director of the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Frank is an SME for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation Wildfire Advisory Council and previously served as a senior policy advisor to the Western Fire Chiefs Association with an emphasis on the development of resilient wildland urban interface communities. His work is grounded in aligning key stakeholders around a core set of parcel and community level mitigations that will disrupt the fire pathways which lead to conflagration. He is pursuing the actuarial evaluation of risk mitigations for both the public and private sectors because we share the same desired outcome, minimizing property loss to the peril of wildfire. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We want to welcome the witnesses and certainly thank you for appearing today. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you can be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes today. Mr. Greenhut, you may begin.
Chairman Fitzgerald, Ranking Member Nadler, and members of the subcommittee. My name's Stephen Greenhut. I'm Western Region Director for the R Street Institute, a free market think tank, and have written extensively about California issues for newspapers and books for the past 27 years. I love the state and want to see it prosper. One of the common themes in my writing has been the state's commitment to expanding bureaucracy and regulation without much regard for whether the new programs accomplish their stated goals. But the Los Angeles wildfires have exposed festering regulatory hurdles that have exacerbated the crisis. Many are years in the making, maddeningly complex, and not given to quick solutions. It's a confluence of bad policy involving brush clearance, water, insurance, firefighting, housing, and climate change. California has created a tangled web of regulation that renders this once innovative state incapable of accomplishing anything efficiently, even environmental protection. Consider California's extensive climate change agenda. Instead of building a resilient system that handles whatever Mother Nature throws our way, our state constantly uses it as an excuse for inaction on nuts and bolts issues. By the way, uncontrolled wildfires undermine whatever progress we're making in reducing carbon dioxide emissions. University of Chicago research found that the 2020 wildfires emitted close to double the state's emissions reductions achieved over 16 years. The governor has agreed that we need to step up brush clearance, but very little happens. The California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, and other laws require environmental impact reports for clearance projects and 2 to 3 approvals for controlled burns. They can take years. The state could, for instance, consider using more funds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to pay for this, rather than prioritizing a high-speed rail system that's unlikely to do much about the climate. It's always an issue of priorities. The wildfires have also highlighted California's counterproductive insurance regulations. I've been writing for years about the coming insurance catastrophe. It can take many months, close to a year, for insurers to wade through the process of hearings, rate reviews, and opposition to such hikes by consumer attorney interveners who earn large fees for their efforts. The problem goes back to Proposition 103, the 1988 ballot initiative that instituted the prior approval system for rate increases and rolled back rates. It created a price control system. Unable to easily adjust rates to reflect risk, insurers quietly, and then not so quietly, began exiting. The insurance commissioner crafted a suite of useful reforms that were showing some promise, but why did it take so long? With this catastrophic wildfire, it remains to be seen whether these changes will be enough to stop the continued exodus of insurers. Many homeowners in the LA area didn't have coverage or were relying on the state-created insurer of last resort, the FAIR Plan, and there's much talk of that bare-bones system facing possible insolvency. Rather than addressing the insurance emergency, the governor and lawmakers found time for a performative special legislative session about so-called oil industry price gouging. Again, it's about priorities. Water policy is a tangential issue related to wildfires, but California has built little new water infrastructure since the 70s, when the population was roughly half what it is today. The state passed a major water bond a decade ago, but we've seen little progress on building traditional infrastructure projects. The California Coastal Commission in 2022 even rejected a privately funded desalination plan in Huntington Beach over concerns about plankton. More water would not have stopped the wildfires, but additional water resources would bolster firefighting efforts and mitigate some of the effects of drought seasons. Instead of building the basic water infrastructure prioritized under the Pat Brown administration, recent administrations have focused almost solely on conservation and rationing. Yet approximately 50% of California's water flows to the Pacific, 40% is used for agriculture, and 10% is for urban uses. Limiting swimming pools and car washing is no solution. We've seen criticisms about an inadequate number of firefighters. Thanks to union power, we see abundance of LA firefighters earning total compensation packages above $500,000 a year, with one captain earning more than $900,000 a year. If pay reflected market rates, California state government and municipalities could afford to hire more of them. Finally, I want to touch on California's cumbersome building regulations, which are a notable hurdle in the rebuilding process. Thankfully, the governor issued an executive order suspending CEQA and the Coastal Act, but why has it taken disaster? State officials have relaxed some rules for arenas and high-density housing, but not in a far-reaching matter. Little by little, California has built up a massive administrative state. I'm hoping the heartbreaking nature of the wildfires will finally cause state officials to rethink this failed approach. Thank you for your time.
You may begin.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, Chairman Fitzgerald, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear today to testify regarding California fires and the consequences of over-regulation. My name is Edward Ring, and I'm the Director of Energy and Water Policy for the California Policy Center, a nonpartisan public policy research institute. My observations over the past decade have led me to the conclusion that many of you may share. Over-regulation over-regulation in California has made the state unaffordable to middle-class and low-income families. It has also endangered our lives, our homes, and our communities, and has harmed the environment at least as much as it has helped. Today's hearing centers on the consequences of overregulation in California with a specific focus on the recent and catastrophic wildfires that consumed thousands of homes in Los Angeles and cost many lives. While no amount of preventive measures or properly applied firefighting resources can stop all of the wildfires in our state, their frequency and their severity is a consequence of overregulation. The regulations most damaging to our forests are, ironically, justified by misguided environmentalist values. Because of environmentalist regulations and litigation pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act, the California Endangered Species Act, and their federal equivalents, California's annual timber harvest is down to 1.5 billion board feet a year, 25% of what it was as recently as the 1980s. These and other environmental laws have nearly killed our logging industry while also making it much harder to do prescribed burns or graze. These forests are dried out, unhealthy, because there are now at least 3 times as many trees, at least 3 times as many trees per acre than the natural density, competing for limited light, water, and soil nutrients. There is an alternative. For example, in 2020, the Creek Fire burned 380,000 acres in the Central Sierra Mountains, but 20,000 acres in the middle of that fire, the watershed around Shaver Lake, didn't burn at all. That's because for several decades, the owners practiced what they call total ecosystem management. They used prescribed burns, mechanical thinning, grazing, and selective logging to manage their forest. Wildlife biologists who were on site claim that species counts in the area actually exceed levels found in forests where state regulations have banned logging. These practices need to be extended to all wildland in California, and in the wildland-urban interface, Los Angeles in particular, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy ought to completely reprioritize their actions to first ensure reducing fire risk. California is only 5% urbanized, and that is where 94% of our state's population lives. We have the most densely populated urban areas of any state in America. The point here is that our state has plenty of open space and wilderness. Going to extreme lengths to return ecosystems to an untouched natural state is not appropriate along the perimeter of a city with 10 million people. And in any case, our government at all levels has not outperformed private landowners in preserving habitat. California's state government has enacted regulations and enabled litigation that rewards special interests while costing taxpayers literally hundreds of billions of dollars. Environmental regulations make housing unaffordable, leaving subsidized developers to inadequately fulfill a mission that the private sector can do. We pay higher utility rates to subsidize renewables. We have carbon sequestration, carbon offset trading, carbon accounting. We have environmental litigation as a business model. Entire new industries created by political decree, producing nothing of value. This disaster in Los Angeles is a clarifying moment. The leaders running California today can allow a deregulated private sector to create millions of good jobs delivering abundant energy, water, lumber, and housing, including rebuilding the lost homes in Los Angeles at a price normal people can afford. Or we can ration our water and energy and land, expecting the government to subsidize millions of households that can no longer afford the essentials. We can manage our environment and expand our suburbs, redefining what constitutes a reasonable environmental impact. Or we can retreat into high-density urban cores and pretend the entire earth should be turned back over to nature. I am including in my written testimony a list of laws that should be repealed, regulations that should be scrapped, and strategies whereby California, hopefully with the help from the federal government, can save our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ring. Mr. Hilton, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and all your colleagues for giving me the opportunity to be here today. My comments reflect both the policy work that I've done that Mr. Kiley mentioned at my organization Golden Together, specifically 2 reports which I'd like to draw your attention to, reducing California's carbon emissions through modern forest management, and secondly, water abundance. But my comments also reflect more recent conversations with Firefighters in Los Angeles, retired firefighters across the state, and the victims of this disaster. And I have to say to the ranking member, those victims will be offended by the remarks we just heard, which were frankly outrageous and offensive, preposterously claiming that the regulations keep us safe. It is the regulations that put Californians in danger, as we have all been highlighting. It's described sometimes, this disaster, as a natural disaster. It is not a natural disaster. This was a man-made disaster, more precisely a Democrat-made disaster. That is not hyperbole. That is the only plausible explanation for the impact here. We are still waiting, of course, to understand the ignition, what precisely ignited these fires. But the impact, there's no question that it was the direct result of Democrat policy and Democrat appointments to the bureaucracies who implemented those policies. As we've been hearing, fire is a natural part of life in these areas that burned. That is not new. We have had fires for decades. We have had fire prevention for decades. But in the last 2 decades, that kind of sensible fire prevention was blocked by Democrat policy. We have heard a lot as we've watched these disasters unfold about containment. What does containment mean? It doesn't mean putting out the fires. It means clearing the perimeter, fuel management, fire prevention. That is what's actually happening. Bulldozers and firefighters with axes. There's a simple question. We can do that before these fire disasters, or we can do it after. The choice that Democrats have made is to force it to be done by our brave firefighters after the event instead of preventively beforehand. Let's be specific. There was an article in the New York Times about Philip and Claire Vogt, who designed and built one of the most fire-resistant homes in America on a peak in the Santa Monica Mountains. Quote, "For months, Philip had been volunteering to clear away the dead undergrowth on the parkland surrounding his property, but California officials told him he could be fined for meddling with a sensitive habitat." Who are these California officials? Number one, CARB, the California Air Resources Board. In 2000, they issued new smoke management regulations that effectively prohibited the kind of controlled burns that were the norm for decades before. As we were hearing, the California Coastal Commission prohibiting sensible fire prevention measures to save a Bronton's milkvetch shrub, which they claim is endangered. And worst of all, as we were hearing, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, every single firefighter that I spoke to in Los Angeles said, what are these people doing, stopping us from taking the sensible steps to keep our communities safe? This is the direct result of overregulation. And I could go on. In 2020, State Senate bill in the California legislature, SB 182, would have mandated fire prevention and resilience, including evacuation routes, vegetation management, fire-safe construction. It was vetoed by Governor Newsom. Here is a quote from his veto letter. "It fails to account for the consequences that could increase sprawl." So yet again, you have sensible fire prevention blocked by overregulation because of ideology about the war on single-family homes that's being waged in California. On and on. Every single aspect of this disaster, the failures that led up to it, the failures of response, all of it the result of Democrat policy. Who else is there to blame? Who else has been in charge in Los Angeles and across the state of California in these years? So now we have some demands. We have demands from the people affected who never want to see this happen again. Number one, any support from Congress for what's happened must include a requirement for the sensible reforms, the common sense measures that we have outlined here and is in the policy reports that we put before you. Safeguards to make sure this money, the federal money, is spent properly, any money. Just as we saw with the 9/11 victim compensation, we need a special master appointed to make sure that money is not wasted. And finally, there is a bill on the desk of Governor Newsom right now for Trump-proofing California, even as he goes to the office and begs for help for his state. Surely a condition of any support must be for Governor Newsom to veto that bill.
Mr. Hilton, thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Falt, you may begin.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Frank Freebolt. I'm the current director of the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. My opinions today are mine. They don't not necessarily represent the CSU system. To the experience and education that was covered initially, I'd like to add that of my time serving in the fire service, 19 of those years were in California. 24 of those years were outside of California. I think this will be important as we look at
Mr. Freiball, can you speak up just a little bit, please?
Make sure your mic's on.
The mic's on.
Is that better? Very good. My apologies. I'm a soft talker. As I said, my name is Frank Freebolt. I am the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute Director at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. My comments today aren't mine. They do not necessarily represent those of the CSU, California State University. My experience that was discussed earlier, I want to make clear that about half of that has been inside of California and about half of it has been outside of California. Additionally, the comments that I'll make are informed by my service on the Western Fire Chiefs Association, which represents the states of Alaska, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, and Oregon. And I also have a multi-state mitigation alignment project underway that mitigations for wildland urban interface properties that involves California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Colorado, Idaho, and Arizona. We are setting out really to solve two problems. The first is unacceptable levels of life and property loss in the wildland urban interface. When we talk about interface, just like we have oceans and land connecting at the coastline, think of the interface as where combustible vegetation meets urban centers. So when we say interface, that's really the intent. The second thing that we are solving for is an impending national financial crisis that will cascade from the insurance market to the realty, mortgage lending, and general obligation municipal bond markets, in my opinion. There is understandably a lot of polarization on this issue. What I can tell you from my time working in the field on these types of disasters is that we need to reframe how we approach this going forward. And I would suggest we do it in the following ways. First, this is an urban conflagration problem. It is not a wildfire problem. It starts as a wildfire problem through embers entering communities and the reception of those communities on buildings. This is well understood through Jack Cohen's work. Second, this is a national problem. It is not just a California problem. Lahaina, Hawaii, the Marshall Fire in Colorado, Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak Fire in New Mexico. This one usually surprises people, unless they lived back there or here. The Gatlinburg fires from 2016. 2,460 structures, 17,000 acres. You don't normally think about that happening there. And it's not just here. Essentially, if you look at the globe, 30 degrees north and south of the equator, Spain, Greece, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, this is not just our issue. Unfortunately, we can learn from those as well. Another reframing is that while climate accelerated this issue, that's really just two of the three primary issues. One is an accumulation of fuel since roughly 1910 due to national policy that made sense at the time, led to unintended consequences. And the second is continued development into fire-dependent landscapes. These landscapes have a return interval that needs to be met. And the third is that while this issue has state and federal consequences, it is always a local government issue. And unless we reframe our approach to the questions and the answers, looking forward into what's coming versus looking backward into what has happened, we're going to continue to pursue things that are not going to be relevant to changing towards the outcomes that we need. I'd give you three things that I think we should commit to. First is we need to prioritize selective management of combustible vegetation within 1/2 mile of wildland urban interface communities above all other vegetation management actions. It's not to their exclusion, but it's that we need to prioritize those spaces. The second is that we need to retroactively harden existing structures in wildland urban interface communities through evidence-based mitigations and create and maintain defensible space around those structures. And to clarify, mitigations mean the various actions that you can take to make these structures less receptive, first and foremost, to embers, and later to structure spread. And third, we need to require the evidence-based mitigations are included in the part of the actuarial pricing of risk and insurance rate setting. We know enough now about those relative contributions to the disruption of fire pathways to understand their value. And I'll end with the first time I understood we had a serious disconnect is I had some property owners that passed our defensible space inspection brilliantly and had a non-renewal before the week was up. And I realized at that point how the fire service and how the insurance industry were looking at the same place, were not connected. And that's where I think that we need to go to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freiwald. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair I recognize myself for a number of questions starting out. The tragedy of recent fires in Los Angeles will undoubtedly made worse by some of the policies that make it impossible for California to manage longstanding fire risks inherent to the state. So, Mr. Ring, let me start with you. Why do you think there is such a resistance to these common sense approaches that many have just heard about this morning, and certainly have been hearing about since the fires happened in LA?
I can't think of a harder question to answer. I find it inexplicable. I do think that some of the motivation for the litigation, for example, that we see against sensible wildland management comes as an economic motive. Again, the regulatory and legal environment, because of these laws, are such that it's very easy to file a lawsuit to try to break any project that's going to develop land or manage wildland. So I think a lot of it would have to do with that. I also think that there is a preoccupation with climate change that sort of diverts people from looking at, I think, what Steve referred to as the nuts and bolts. If you're truly concerned about climate change, you should be wanting to pursue sensible policies with more urgency, not less. So I think it's partly ideology, and I think it's partly some perverse incentives caused by the legal environment that we've created.
So what could the federal government do? What kind of steps could we take to ensure that all states, including California, have less roadblocks to mitigate?
An act of Congress could, for example, make losers pay in frivolous lawsuits that have to do with environmental issues. I think that would be a reform that would cut across every law or regulation that's being exploited currently. Whereas if you, for example, reform the Endangered Species Act, which is also necessary, and reforming NEPA is also necessary. But if you also assign a responsibility to litigants that file frivolous lawsuits, you would take care of every regulation that's being exploited in that manner.
Do you think there's anything that we're seeing and experiencing with the fires in California that would lead you to maybe scrutinize some of the statutes at the state level in other states that also experience forest fires, wildfires that California just experienced, that makes sense, that there is a state to look towards to maybe fine-tune what's going on in California?
Well, I can say that in California, it would probably be helpful to take away the waivers that permit California to enact all kinds of laws that go well in excess of federal regulations. As far as an example of a state that's managing their wildlands more responsibly, I can't answer that with specific knowledge, but I think that in the southeastern United States, a lot of forest management is done in a way that makes a lot more sense.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Greenhut, let me ask you, many states require that state insurance commissioner has to approve a rate increase before it takes effect. The fast rate approvals are a crucial component of healthy state insurance markets. Many of us that served in state legislature worked in that area. So Is there something that you're seeing that stands out when it comes to California that's lacking in this area, or some of the moves or changes that have been made as a result of trying to better position themselves and unfortunately failing when it comes to insurance rates?
There are about 12 states with prior approval systems, and California's is the strictest. You pointed out in your opening that, well, for one thing, it made the insurance commissioner an elected position. There aren't a lot of insurance commissioners, often are looking to higher office, who want to be the person who approved a major rate hike. And the problem is, this has been going on for years. We're not able to just adjust the rates and their process. There are things that could be done within the Prop 103 process. We could speed up the rate approval process, and California is notoriously slow for that. And it's supposed to, by the initiative, these rate reviews are supposed to take place within 60 to 180 days. And the average is somewhere like 293 days. And then, there's one example. We have these interveners who are consumer attorneys, and one of their consumer watchdog is one of them, and their predecessor group wrote the initiative, and they earn substantial fees, essentially opposing any sort of rate increase, and that just drags it out. There's one quick example.
I think we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit further on that issue.
Sure.
So I'm going to yield back, and I'm going to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I first must respond to Mr. Hilton's inflammatory comments on my statement. Rules that prevent people's roofs from burning, rules that get rid of inflammatory material around homes, rules that mean that the house next door is less of a fire threat to your own. These are rules that save lives. Blanket deregulation would heighten fire risk, not lower it. We have heard claims from Republicans, including President Trump, that the water systems in California were strained because of overregulation. But with the exception of one small reservoir that was down for scheduled maintenance, the reservoirs were full when the fire started. According to some estimates, when the Palisades fire started, there were 3 million gallons of water stored locally. But the demand to fight the fires was 4 times greater than the system had ever encountered. The widespread and simultaneous use of hydrants across the affected area did cause water pressure to drop, but as experts have explained, quote, hydrants are designed for fighting fires at 1 or 2 houses at a time, not hundreds. As one expert in the field observed, quote, we have really no lack of water. What we have is an infrastructure that is not made to fight cataclysmic fires, biblical-sized fires. Director Freefalt, for these large-scale urban fires like ones in Eaton and Palisades, would you say that these are once-in-a-career fires?
Thank you for the question. Initially, when I started, maybe. But we can look at, you have plenty of access to the history and records and severity of wildland urban interface fire institutes or incidents. They're certainly on a rise. But I would also mention that to date, our largest acreage, life and property losses actually occurred a long time ago. First one was, at least it was recorded in this way, 1871 in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. That was burned somewhere between 1.5 million to 2.4 million acres. Between 1,200 to 2,500 people were killed. It jumped Green Bay. 16 towns were burned in that process.
Thank you. I have one other question. After large fires like these, we should be doing everything we can to help people in need, not pointing fingers and trying to blame elected leaders. You made a number of recommendations, but what would be most helpful to the people of California during this difficult time?
Well, right now we need to focus on the recovery part, for sure. As we move forward, I'll go back to the 3 concurrent integrated actions that I mentioned in my opening statement. We have to prioritize selective management of fuel treatment immediately around wildland urban interface communities. We need to retroactively harden the existing inventory of structures. And we need to require evidence-based mitigations to be included in the pricing of risk.
Thank you. I now yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, who can speak to the devastation and the need for disaster relief funds.
Thank you, Ranking Member Nadler, for using your time. Thank you, Chairman Fitzgerald, for letting me attend. Mr. Hilton, are you a firefighter?
I'm not a firefighter.
Mr.
but
Ring,
I've
are you a
spoken to
firefighter?
many
Mr. Ring,
firefighters
it's
about
just a
this
yes
issue.
or no question. Mr. Ring, are you a firefighter? No. All right, Mr. Greenhut, are you a firefighter?
I'm not a firefighter.
The
Are you a firefighter?
The northern part of my district was evacuated. I've talked to numerous firefighters. I've visited the intensive damage. I've had multiple briefings from firefighters, first responders, and fire chiefs. This is what they told me. The reason these fires in Southern California spread so quickly, caused so much damage, was because of Santa Ana winds that reached unprecedented gusts of 100 miles per hour. Gusts so high that helicopters and the airplanes could not fly. Also because of very low relative humidity and the driest conditions in California history. None of the firefighters said it was about overregulation or homeless people or the Delta smelt fish or the timber harvest or voter ID laws. So shame on anyone who is exploiting the pain and suffering of disaster victims to jam through partisan ideological policies. We should get disaster aid to these disaster victims now without conditions, just like we treat every other disaster victim across America. We just gave aid this past December to South Carolina, Florida, Oklahoma. The Democrats say, hey, we want you to do better on climate change policies in your state. No, we just gave that aid because these are Americans who are suffering. So do not exploit them. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ranking member has a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since the majority is having this hearing on California fires without the participation of members who represent the Palisades and Eaton, I seek unanimous consent to enter statements from Representatives Chu and Sherman into the record.
Without objection, we now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think we're all here trying to learn more about how to prevent these situations from developing in the future. And I want to just, first of all, thank all of you for being on the panel today and sharing. And I want to address a question to Mr. Stephen Greenhut, if I may. Recently, areas of my own home state of North Carolina that were devastated by Hurricane Helene are now dealing with wildfires ourselves. Unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, the aftermath of the storm's destruction has been providing fuel for these fires. And I want to talk for a moment about the concept of utilizing controlled burns to mitigate wildfires. I know there are prescribed burn projects that happen in my district, and I think it's important that they continue, but it's my understanding that implementing prescribed burns has become more difficult due to the regulations in California. And Mr. Greenhut, are there significant barriers that exist in California to exercising these prescribed burns? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, the California Environmental Quality Act, which continues to come up, CEQA, it just imposes enormous hurdles and delays to doing any sort of project. So when we had these horrific wildfires up in Paradise in Butte County, after the fires, it took 2 years before the county was even able to let out contracts for brush clearance. There was a previous fire where it took 18 months, I believe, to get a CEQA approval to do some brush clearance, and the community was destroyed shortly thereafter. So CEQA is a huge hurdle for everything. And one of the points about CEQA, we hear a lot that, we need these regulations to protect the environment. But the CEQA delays and lawsuit process doesn't help the environment. I was just looking up, 49% of lawsuits, CEQA lawsuits, are public projects, and many of them are environmental projects, including parks, university housing, renewable energy. 80% of them are infill projects, which are, a lot of people in California say we need more of those to deal with climate change, and yet the lawsuits target those projects. And 64% of the lawsuits are from associations such as unions which don't have a history of environmental activism. So in other words, they use them to secure wage concessions. So is this helping the environment? And if we're slowing prescribed burns and brush clearance, and we've done very little, we're supposed to do about, according to CAL FIRE, about 1 million acres of clearance a year on federal and state land, and have been doing around 125,000 acres a year. And the governor said we need to do more of it. It's just we haven't seen more of it. And so yes.
Well, and that was going to be a follow-up question. I understand that Governor Newsom publicly committed to step up the rate of mechanical thinning and prescribed burns in order to clean up the excessive fuel in the forest. And again, I'll just ask you, has Governor Newsom followed through on that commitment at this point?
Well, I agree with what he's saying needs to be done. What I'm looking at is that we have all these bureaucratic hurdles. So I think even if a governor issues an executive order, everything still gets just gummed up in the works. And that's kind of what I want to address, is some of these long-term regulatory issues, not, the short-term partisan issues. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, and I want you to use the balance of the time. If you were in charge of setting policy related to forest management and prescribed burns, what changes would you make?
Well, I think the focus, since I'm not an expert in forest clearance, is dealing with CEQA. I mean, that is an impediment to everything. And our state, whenever there's a project our state needs to, some lawmaker wants to get through, such as the Kings Arena in Sacramento, what's the first thing they do? A CEQA exemption. State has offered CEQA exemptions on different high-density housing projects. I agree with that. It's just that we need to do it in a far-reaching manner so that all sorts of projects are spared the delays, the added costs, and often developers and public agencies don't even propose projects because they know it's going to lead to lawsuits and years of litigation and higher costs.
Well, and again, let me just say in closing, I want to thank all of you on the panel for what you're sharing. I don't think anybody is here to exploit anything today. I think we're here because we want to get the takeaways that can help us prevent anything like this from happening again. Certainly, I feel that way for my own home state of North Carolina and others around the country. So thank you, gentlemen, for sharing.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I appreciate the remark of the gentleman from North Carolina that we should not be here to engage in political rhetoric and exploitation of these terrible events. States, counties, localities all over America are affected by weather calamities that are coming on with extraordinary velocity because of climate change. I want to yield to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, several minutes in order to pursue his line of questions.
Thank you, Ranking Member Raskin. So the majority's witnesses, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Ring, and Mr. Greenhut, are not firefighters. But thank goodness we do have a firefighter on this panel today, Mr. Frevolt, who not only was a firefighter, he was a fire chief. And he, in his testimony, talks about that this is not a traditional wildfire. This is a wildland-urban conflagration. And I'm going to show you in a little bit a video of what was happening. But I just want to explain, when you solve for the wrong problem, not only do you not get the solution, you can cause harm. So Donald Trump has it in his mind that somehow there's a spigot in Northern California, he's going to open a valve and dump water to Southern California. Here are the facts. Southern California's reservoirs are at near record levels when this fire happened. Didn't matter because Donald Trump then ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to release over 2 billion gallons of water that almost flooded farmland, if not for the local water districts that pushed back. But guess what? This water was saved for the farmers for the summer season when they needed the water. And so the president wasted all this water that isn't even reaching Southern California. It's going to evaporate for a PR stunt. So this was a harmful, ludicrous action to solve for the wrong problem. And so I want to show a video now of what was happening in the Eaton fire that wiped out Altadena. Just watch this 15-second video. That is not a timber harvest problem, not a desalinization problem, not a homeless person problem, not a voter ID problem. That is burning embers being blown by unprecedented Santa Ana winds that reach up to 100 miles per hour. And these burning embers that could be softball size would fly for miles and miles and miles and hit a structure and set that structure on fire. And then that structure became the fuel for the fire. That's what was happening. The structures became the fuel for the fire. And so, Mr. Freeval, can you talk about, first of all, confirm that that is true, and then explain in your testimony about strengthening sort of these structures with fire-resistant materials?
Concur with what you said initially. Repeat the last part of your question, please.
In your testimony, you talk about how to harden some of
Yes.
these structures with fire-resistant materials, which actually is something that might make sense, not for the other random policies that the majority of witnesses are trying to jam through on ideological reasons.
I would point to two standing sets of work that we could start on yesterday. The first is the Wildfire Prepared Home designation from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. That's a package of mitigations that has been proven to be effective on really two things. It is preventative embers getting into structures and then starting the structure itself on fire. And it also helps with low duration, low intensity fire in and around the structure. While those are necessary, they're insufficient when we get high concentrations of structure. We need to get enough of those parcel level mitigations done to protect structure to structure spread. If you just do one here, one there, you'll still lose that piece. The second one comes out of the National Institute for Standards Technology, Technical Note 2205, Hazard Mitigation Methodology. Excellent set of recommendations.
Thank you. And let me just say this. It is particularly outrageous for witnesses to somehow blame Democrats. You know who signed CEQA? Ronald Reagan. That's who signed CEQA. And Governor Newsom pre-positioned assets before this fire. But those helicopters and airplanes could not fly over the Eden fire because of the 100-mile-per-hour winds. That was the truth. That is what happened. Go do your own research. I yield back.
And I'll yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. We now recognize gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden.
I yield my time to Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman yields his time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. First, I want to assure Mr. Liu that Messrs. Hilton and Ring and Greenhut are three of the most insightful experts on California public policy that I've had the honor to work with during my 45 years of public service, and I can't imagine a more distinguished panel than we have before us right now. Mr. Liu might also be surprised to learn that before the modern era, California lost 4.5 million acres a year on average to catastrophic fire. Then in the 20th century, we established land management agencies to do a little of the gardening ourselves instead of leaving it to nature. We auctioned off excess timber to logging companies that paid us to remove the excess. We leased public lands to cattle and sheep ranchers to suppress brush growth through grazing. We did controlled burns to remove undergrowth. We cut fire breaks to contain fires. We used herbicides to keep brush from residential areas. We put out fires before they could explode out of control. And our fire losses declined from 4.5 million acres a year on average to just 250,000 acres a year throughout the 20th century. But we don't do those practices anymore. Our fire losses are now back up to an average of 1.5 million acres in 2020, 4.5 million acres. Mr. Greenhut, what happened?
Thanks, Congressman. It just seems like an ideological shift. We've moved towards land preservation at all costs. And I was just looking through, thinking of
But it doesn't preserve the land, does it? It's caused the incineration of the land.
Exactly. I mean, the idea was to preserve species. I mean, we pointed out before that we. And some of it's growth control, too. Pointed out that a project was stopped for hardening the telephone poles over concerns about an endangered weed. It's this, yeah.
Mr. Ring, is this a policy issue or is this an act of God?
Everything's an act of God, but policy has a lot to do with what actually happens. California's forests, since the enforcement of environmental regulations became more aggressive, are now overgrown. I know you're very familiar with this. The average tree density, and this is verified by several studies from universities in California, Merced, Berkeley, Davis, elsewhere. The tree density in the Central Sierra is now about 5 times what's historically normal. The ladder fuels, which would ordinarily, that's the scrub and underbrush and young trees, which would normally burn in controlled burns or fires started by lightning strikes. When that doesn't happen anymore, you have trees that are allegedly dying because of climate change, but they're actually dying because you've got so many more trees competing with the same amount of light,
you can
nutrients.
You can actually tell the boundary between the private lands that are not subject to these laws and the public lands just by the condition of the forests on each side of that boundary line. How clever of the climate to know exactly where the boundary lines are and only decimate the federal lands. I can offer some good news, and that is in 2016, we got a categorical exclusion from NEPA for forest thinning projects in the Tahoe Basin Management Unit. That simple change has taken the environmental studies from 4.5 years down to just a few months. It's taken the environmental reports from 800 pages down to a few dozen. It's increased the timber yield on the Tahoe Basin from 1 million board feet a year to 9 million board feet a year. It's tripled the amount of treated acreage. That's what saved the town of South Lake Tahoe from the Caldor fire. Unfortunately, right across the boundary line was the town of Grizzly Flats that was not protected by this law. It was completely incinerated by the same fire. Now, we got those provisions finally this year, just a few weeks ago, into the Fix Our Forests Act. It passed the House with 141 Democrats opposing it. Mr. Hilton, I'll give you the final word. What would you say to those Democrats?
I think I'd first of all say to Mr. Liu, I think we'd take his righteous indignation a little bit more seriously if he wasn't in nearly every single case the first to jump on one of the terrible tragedies that we see too often in our country of mass shooting, to immediately call for the kinds of reforms that would stop it happening.
These fires have nothing to do with mass shootings.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to do, to stop people dying, to stop people losing their homes, to stop the terrible human and economic cost of these fires. That's what we are here arguing for, those kinds of changes that could be made and would stop the severity and impact of these kinds of fires.
Gentlemen's time has expired. We'll now go to gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank and welcome our witnesses here today. Very important issue for California as well as the rest of the country. I'm a lifelong Californian. I know the Santa Ana winds. They're hot, dry, strong, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Just heard Mr. Liu talk about 100-mile-an-hour winds. This time, this area, it was the perfect storm. Hurricane-strength winds, along with prolonged droughts in Southern California, made just fighting these fires impossible, led to devastation, loss of property, and terribly, loss of life. But natural disasters are plaguing every state. Floods, hurricanes, fires, and insurance companies are leaving many states, not just California. In Texas, led the nation when it came to natural disasters. From 2004 to 2024, there were $179 billion plus natural disasters in Texas. North Carolina had 82. Virginia had 80. Wisconsin had 49. Wyoming had 31. Florida had 61. And California had 31. These disasters occur in every state, and their frequency is increasing. These disasters, these perfect storms, I would say, occur more and more. Last May in Texas, a storm with hurricane-force winds knocked out power to over 1 million homes and businesses. And in Florida and North Carolina, Hurricane Helene caused historic flooding and tremendous damage. Catastrophic wildfires have occurred across the nation, including the German Road fire in Wisconsin and the Great Smoky Mountains wildfire in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And insurers are fleeing these states. In Florida and in Louisiana, many insurers have either left or gone bankrupt. And in Texas and North Carolina and many other states, you're seeing tremendous rate increases. In Texas, which experienced $16 billion weather-related events in 2023, 5 major insurers have ended or limited their coverage. Florida, Louisiana, and North Carolina all have reported non-renewal rates greater than that in California in 2023. And nationwide, non-renewal rates have jumped up 30% from 2018 to 2022. So what we're trying to say is, this is not a California crisis. This is a national crisis. We're California. Everybody likes to bash us. We are the center of the universe, that I'd say. We're the center of high tech, biotech, and we are the center of the entertainment industry. And by the way, we're the number 5 economy in the world. I hope that doesn't bring us any tariffs. We're also home to 70% of the venture capital in the US. And of course, home to 40 million people. Let's be clear, disaster aid should never be preconditioned on political agendas. All of us here have voted for aid for other states when they needed it. And we do learn from every disaster in California. Right now, California has dedicated billions of dollars, nearly doubling the amount we spent in 2019 to address the causes of forest fires. And CAL FIRE and others have worked on over 1 million acres to reduce these activities that would lead to fires. California, we're doing our job. It's just the situations have been impossible. We're all Americans, and I hope all of us remember that when it comes to disaster relief. When one American suffers, the rest of us need to show up and help. That's what we do best. Mr. Chair, I'm out of time. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Hageman. Ms. Hageman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Climate change and global warming are the scapegoats for the Democrats and radical environmentalists to deflect attention from their failed policies and the destruction caused by their own actions. In 2001, under Bill Clinton, the Forest Service adopted the roadless rule, which was designed to deny access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands. We warned at the time that this rule would cause catastrophic forest fires, reduce the amount of water available for communities for farming and other uses, and also result in catastrophic pine beetle outbreaks, which is in fact exactly what has occurred. Every single one of the things that we described would happen has in fact happened, and California has suffered maybe more than many of the states. Recently, the gentleman who ran the Forest Service under Joe Biden actually admitted in a hearing that the roadless rule was one of the primary roadblocks to proper and effective forest range management. So to say that the government is always trying to fix its last solution, I don't think you need to look any further than the roadless rule. California has essentially the same water infrastructure in place today with 40 million people that it had in the 1960s with 16 million people. So when we talk about putting conditions on the kind of relief that is going to be necessary to help to rebuild California, it must include additional water infrastructure and fire mitigation methods to avoid having these kinds of catastrophes happen ever again. I have an article that I have just recently pulled up. It stated that Newsom vetoed a bill to enhance fire mitigation so he could grab the land for affordable housing. This was a bill that was introduced in 2020, SB 182. It was authored by then State Senator Hannah Beth Jackson, a Democrat from Santa Barbara, whose district had just suffered the Thomas Fire. This bill sought to increase local planning requirements and guidelines for permitting development in certain fire hazard severity zones. But what happened to that bill? It passed through both the Senate and the House. It was actually a very good bill. What happened? Mr. Newsom vetoed it. Why did he veto it? Because it did not comport with his idea of getting rid of single-family homes and pushing people into multifamily homes. And in his veto letter, he actually stated, wildfire resilience must become a more consistent part of land use and development decisions. However, whenever a politician uses the word however, you know they're going in the opposite direction, don't you? However, it must be done while meeting our housing needs. And for him, he wanted the money and the attention and the policy to focus on multifamily homes, not in protecting and hardening the resources available for the existing homes. So call me a bit skeptical when I hear the folks on the other side jump up and down and scream and yell about the fact that they've been doing everything necessary to try to harden and try to address these catastrophes when the exact opposite is in fact true. These catastrophes that we have seen over the last couple of months did not need to happen. This is not about climate change. This is not about global warming. This is about bad land use decisions, bad policies, and restrictions of being able to actually make the kinds of changes that must be made. Mr. Ring, while you were being questioned earlier, you mentioned the need for ESA reform and penalties for frivolous lawsuits, but I don't think that you had sufficient time to explain what you were referring to. Would you please explain what you were talking about?
Well, Steve has talked about this as well, and it applies to almost any kind of development or land use decision in California. There are laws, and it's not just CEQA, it's the California Air Quality Management, the CARB is a agency, and the Coastal Commission, which came up. But there's countless laws and regulations that provide grounds for lawsuits. One of the things that might be a very meaningful reform to CEQA would be to take away standing to third-party attorneys that truly have used CEQA as a business model and restrict CEQA lawsuits to district attorneys and the state attorney general. And by the way, when CEQA was signed by Governor Reagan in 1970, it was a two-page document that could be filed within weeks. And now it's an 800-page document that
Mr. Ring, the
takes
gentleman's
years.
time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
We're not going to go to Mr. Correa for a UC.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit some documents for the record.
Yeah, without objection.
First one, Progressive Insurance becomes the latest insurer to flee Texas, October 19, 2024. Second one, 15 states facing imminent insurance crisis, October 4th, 2024. Third one, insurance crisis that started in Florida in California is now spreading. Your state could be next, July 2nd, 2024. Fourth one, California isn't the only place where insurers are dropping homeowners, January 18th, 2025. Fifth one, letter from Congressman Costa to Secretary Hesgreth, dated February 1st, 2025, concerning unplanned water releases. And the sixth one, a letter from members of the California delegation to the Chairman Fitzgerald and Ranking Member Nadler, dated February 5th, 2025, supporting California's insurance regulation. Thank you.
Without objection, the chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Vermont, Ms. Ballant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The scale of this disaster is really almost impossible to comprehend. We've got 29 people who are dead. We've got 16,000 structures that were destroyed, so many Californians injured. And while these devastating fires were raging on, Republicans' first reaction was to blame the wildfires on, quote, DEI. So I'd like every witness to answer this simple question, yes or no, starting with Mr. Green Greenhut, do you believe that people in Los Angeles died because the fire chief is a lesbian? Yes or no? Do you believe? No. Okay. Mr. Ring, do you believe people in Los Angeles died because the fire chief is a lesbian?
No.
Great. Mr. I don't know because your name is now upside down. Mr. Hilton, do you believe that people in Los Angeles died because the fire chief is a lesbian?
No.
Mr. Freeble, do you believe that the people of Los Angeles died because the fire chief is a lesbian?
No.
Great. So, glad we established that. But I want to remind everyone that while fires raged through Main Street and Palisades, Elon Musk said that DEI means people die, in reference to the Los Angeles Fire Department's response. And my House colleagues seem to agree. This here is a tweet from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene posted on her official social media. It says, "How's your DEI mayor of Los Angeles working out for you?" So it's become crystal clear that the phrase DEI is used in place of much more offensive terms to talk about people of color, to talk about women, queer people in this country. It's sickening, and they're literally saying this while people were dying. So obviously, this has nothing to do with the families who lost everything. It does not do anything for the communities that were destroyed. It's an absolutely wrong way to deal when you have a natural disaster. And I know, because the last 2 summers in Vermont, we've had catastrophic flooding. What people need in this moment is leadership. Americans need us to get the resources that they need out to them immediately. America does not need a president that is hell-bent on dismantling our federal emergency management system or conditioning aid to California to profit off of a community's devastation. All this talk of DEI is a complete and utter distraction from the fact that we need a plan, an actual plan to help the people of California who lost everything. At this point, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time to the gentle lady from California, Ms. Kamala-Gradov.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for yielding me your time. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to be here. You know, I love California, and I don't like people shading my state. But sometimes funding disparities in a national election out of the 5th largest economy in the world, California, can roil a person's feelings about our state as a whole. But these frail emotions should not debilitate a leader's execution of their job serving all of the American people. California fires and the consequences of over-regulation is a gross title misnomer. Mr. Freevault, I have a few yes or no questions for you. Would you agree that the Eaton fire happened in Altadena, an unincorporated portion of Los Angeles County? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Is it safe to say that LA County has more relaxed zoning ordinances and building regulations than the city of Los Angeles?
I do not have enough knowledge to give you a yes or no answer.
The answer is yes. Would you agree that permissive building codes, the notion of permissive building codes, are antithetical to over-regulation?
The details in that question are
It's a very
too far
simple
for me
question.
to answer yes or no.
Permissive building codes does not equal over-regulation.
I can't answer the question.
All right, I'm going to answer that for you, yes. Because at the end of the day, I would say, and I don't know if you would agree, that the entire framing of this hearing is actually based on a false premise. Yes or no?
I believe we're approaching the discussion from a legacy standpoint. We're looking in backwards in the discussions and the questions. We need to be looking forwards.
We do, and instead of blaming California for overregulation, we should be talking about ways to help the thousands of people who lost their lives in these fires, including some of my own family members. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Yield back. Now recognize the chairman of the committee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hilton, you said in your testimony the speed, scale, and destructiveness of the fires was the direct result of Democrat policies. I want to know why. I mean, I assume those policies are like why they stopped logging in California, why they stopped clearing controlled burns and other things that's been mentioned by all the experts and some of our colleagues. Why would they stop those things if they were working?
The answer is that, as we were discussing earlier, there's an ideology in play which is extreme, and it avoids the kind of common sense action that had been taken for years. And that's what is at the heart of the fuel load. That is the key concept here. Of course, it's true that there are winds, but it's not true to say that these Santa Ana winds were unprecedented. They were the highest in 14 years, but not unprecedented. When we hear about Los Angeles, of course I agree about the points that were made in relation to the fire chief. But there is an important, if we could use a different, take one letter from the acronym DEI and just take the I and start a different word with it, incompetence, because you did see a total lack of coordination between the city firefighting force and the county and other leadership. You saw a massive delay in getting equipment to that first fire, which could have made a big difference in containing it. 44 minutes before anyone was there. You had the warnings of this disaster on January the 2nd of severe winds, on January the 3rd, life-threatening winds. On January the 4th, the mayor leaves the country. You saw a total unprecedented set of incompetent responses in preparation. The policy failures, we've outlined them. The brush clearance was stopped, and so the fuel load was higher, and that meant that this conflagration spread so much quicker than it need have been. A point that Mr. Nadler made about the reservoir, we need to address this. He talked about a small reservoir. No, it was 117 million gallons. It was built in the 1960s precisely for the purposes of dealing with wildfires. That's why it was built. It was offline for 1 year. Why was it offline for a year? Because it was in action to comply with federal regulation about the covers, a small tear in the cover, and they empty the reservoir for a year. These are serious points. I hear all the time, we mustn't politicize, mustn't make it political. I agree with that, but it is about policy. It is about policy choices that were made that led up to the scale and severity and impact of that. On insurance as well, I hear this talk about Florida. No, it's a different reason we had a crisis in Florida with insurance. It's about scam, frivolous lawsuits, which has been addressed by the governor. In California, one of the reasons that insurance costs are so high is because it costs 4 or 5 times as much to build the exact same floor plan for a building in California as it does in neighboring states. Why? Because of the building codes, because of the CEQA legislation, exactly as my colleague was saying, we need to end the private right of action under CEQA. That would make a huge difference. You can help with that. We are all here to stop this kind of thing happening again. And there are practical, common sense things we can do, which all of us have laid out.
I'm going to yield my time to the gentleman from California, the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. And in response to the gentlewoman from Vermont, I think the issue here is that, for example, there was one firefighter turned whistleblower who said that LA will only purchase from vendors that support DEI, resulting in the fire department having to go with a vendor that will have to pay twice as much, or the shipment may take twice as long because of that requirement. And so I think the point is that a public safety organization should be singularly focused on public safety, and this is not the place for ideology or social engineering. But Mr. Hilton, one of the things that was appalling to many of us in the middle of the fires was that our governor, Gavin Newsom, set up a political website that was devoted to promoting himself and defending his record and trying to deflect blame, and a rapid response organization designed to attack people and call any criticism of his record misinformation. So I do think it's important to set the record straight. This is a story from Capital Public Radio from a few years ago. Now, is Cap Radio, is that the local Fox News affiliate or something, Mr.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, it's the NPR affiliate.
It's
I think,
NPR.
Right? Not known to be a right-leaning conservative outlet. Here's the headline. Newsom misled the public about wildfire prevention efforts ahead of the worst fire season on record. An investigation from Cap Radio and NPR's California newsroom found the governor has misrepresented his accomplishments and even disinvested in wildfire prevention. The investigation found Newsom overstated by an astounding 690% the number of acres treated with fuel breaks and prescribed burns in the very forestry projects he said needed to be prioritized to protect the state's most vulnerable communities. So if it's true that fuel management and fuel reduction projects are so unimportant, as we're hearing from the other side today, then why did the governor feel the need to lie about it? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to all the witnesses here today. Now, in my opinion, the topic of this hearing is missing the point. What we should be focusing on is, one, how to help now, and two, how to address the root causes of drought and intensifying fires to prevent this from happening again. But instead, we've seen officials in the Trump administration are talking about DEI instead of how we're going to help people. My colleague, Representative Blint, has already made that point. They're talking about how to cut disaster aid instead of letting FEMA do its job, which is literally to help people after disasters. I'd like to hear from Mr. Freevold, our witness, who's a retired fire chief. And please, a yes or no answer. The question won't be that difficult. Yes or no, is DEI making firefighters less effective?
No.
Thank you. And that's so right. So contrary to Elon Musk's claims that the LA firefighters did not prioritize DEI over saving lives. That is a lie, and it is a slap in the face to dedicated professionals and volunteers across the country who undergo rigorous training and risk their lives to save others. It was offensive when President Trump used DEI to blame air traffic controllers, and it's offensive here too. And despite Trump's lies about FEMA, the agency continues to help disaster-impacted communities during times of great need. So again, I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Freevold. Mr. Freevold, yes or no? Is climate change worsening disasters?
From the fire perspective, the one element of climate change I can speak to is vapor pressure deficit.
Is that a yes?
That part is making it more severe, yes.
Thank you, sir. So as climate change worsens, disasters across the country, and as FEMA disaster declarations rise, districts across the country, represented members across the political spectrum, are at risk. In fact, in 2 Illinois counties from my district that it runs through, Cook County and DuPage County, we've had no fewer than 5 disasters declared since 2019. 2 of those disasters, both flooding related, hit my district real hard, and many of my constituents were able to receive FEMA's assistance for repairs and losses. Without further ado, Mr. Chair, I would like to yield my time to my friend from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I've toured the Altadena area. I visited the Palisades. I've had disasters in my own district, fire and flood. And every person in those disasters and experiences told me the same thing. They just want the government to help them. They just want the government to help them. That's what a woman told me when she stood on a pile of ashes in the Palisades and brought gloves and a large garbage bag and searched for any memento for her child and walked away with a tin bowl that her daughter uses in her make-believe kitchen. She's not worried about the red team or the blue team. She's not worried about did DEI cause this or not. She just wants the government to help them. My colleagues, including Mr. Issa, we walked Altadena last week together. We heard the fire chief say these were 80-mile-per-hour winds. He said it would have taken every fire engine in California to stop the devastation that occurred in California. So I just asked my colleagues, let's work together on this. Let's be in the solutions business. Don't use DEI as an alibi. Because when the president blames DEI on an air disaster and blames DEI on a fire disaster, what that tells me is DEI to you stands for didn't even investigate. That's what it means to fire victims in California as well. So we're in the solutions business here. And Chief Freevold, I'd like for you to just tell us, as we move forward, as we look at code and zoning, what can we do to better protect against unseasonable winds in this new era that we're in?
I'd return back to my opening statements on the 3 concurrent integrated actions. I don't believe you're here for there, but essentially prioritize selective management of combustible fuels immediately adjacent to wildland-urban interface communities, retroactively harden existing structures in WUI communities through evidence-based mitigations with defensible space, and require evidence-based mitigations to be included in part of the actuarial pricing of insurance rate setting.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Garcia. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now go to Congressman from California, Mr. Isom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And hello, Mr. Hilton. I'm going to direct my questions toward you, but I'm going to first thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Swalwell, because we were there together. We did stand together. We heard the same chiefs say the same thing. Problem is, he mentioned something that absolutely is true. Those people, the firefighters and the residents of Altadena, could not have stopped that fire. It was not going to happen with 80-mile-an-hour sustained winds. Whether there was unlimited water or not, it would have gone sideways. It wouldn't have gone down if they dropped it. We heard that together. We also heard a question from one of our mayors who asked, looking up at the hill where we were told the fire began, and they actually had camera footage of it beginning, could you have stopped it? No, exactly as Mr. Swalwell said. Then he asked, well, but if it had been cleared, would this have happened? And he said, absolutely not. So we have two truisms. One is no amount of water, no amount of fire equipment in the state in any way, shape, or form could have stopped a sustained 80-mile-an-hour wind with an unlimited amount of fuel that had built up over 30 years, never having been cleared under California law. Follow-up questions, Mr. Hilton. Mayor of Vista asked the question, well, why wasn't it cleared? And he said, we can't get the authority. He said on the other side of the mountain, on more federal land, some of it has been, but we have not been able to get a controlled burn on that in 30 years. And I'm going to ask you just one more follow-up, give you one more follow-up question, and then I'll explain it to you. Amazingly, we asked, is this fire, could it happen again? He said, oh, after what happened there, it couldn't happen again for a decade because it's been cleared.
Yes.
So, Mr. Hilton, is that what you're trying to achieve? Is that what you're bringing to us? Is the common sense question of why didn't we clear it and when are we going to clear similar hillsides so that people not suffer again?
Exactly. It is the best and most simple, common sense, preventative measure we can take. Here it is. This is the California Air Resources Board, 2000, their new smoke management guidelines, which prevented the clearance. Those hills haven't been cleared for 25 years. How's the smoke now? I mean, it's just so counterproductive. I'm not saying it's ill-intentioned, but the consequences have been deadly and devastating. As I mentioned earlier, the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy, stopping people, saying you're going to be fined if you take responsible action to clear the brush. As I said earlier, it's our firefighters who end up having to clear the brush after the event. That's what they're doing when they say we're containing the fire. They're using bulldozers and axes to stop the perimeter from spreading. Why don't we do it before? And then we can prevent this loss of life. I agree with Mr. Swalwell. We need solutions. I totally agree. That's why my organization, Golden Together, we published a document, Rescue, Reform, Rebuild, with specific recommendations for how we can stop it happening again, even on the question of firefighting. We can learn from other countries who do this better, using technology to spot fires much more early so they can be extinguished earlier, so they don't spread and turn into these kinds of
And if I can call on my colleague, Mr. Swalwell, again, last month I introduced H.R. 71, and oddly enough, what you see behind me is the amount of pages of green tape-wrapped bureaucracy we would eliminate if H.R. 731 passes. Yes, that's 5 feet of single line printing that we would eliminate. That's what we're trying to do, and I would hope that my colleague would look at the bill, join me in cutting through some of that red tape. I want to leave with one thing. We have a lot to do together. Hopefully this hearing is going to cause people to realize that we can't blame just the water reservoir. We can't blame not enough firemen, or we certainly can't blame the homeowners. We have to blame the fact that we created an event that was going to happen sooner or later. It happened to happen there. But Mr. Hilton, what you brought to us today, and all of you, is the reality that this will happen again the next time there's a spark and a sustained wind in California and fuel that has not been taken away for more than 30 years. So I'm hoping that we learn from this. I'm hoping that my colleagues and I can work together on the points that we can agree on. And I want to thank the witnesses for bringing up the fact that this was preventable. The problem was your government. Thank you. To yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was also able to visit the scene of the fire last week with my colleague, Mr. Ison Swalwell. It was just tragic. I mean, really, the devastation is hard to comprehend. And the people, thousands and thousands of people who lost everything, it's really tragic. We need to work together to make sure that we do our very best to prevent something like that from ever happening again. But I do think it's important that we have the facts in front of us. For example, under the state's leadership, the number of CAL FIRE personnel nearly doubled from 2019 to the present. The state has now invested $2 billion in managing and reducing the fuel load in forests. And in fact, the prescribed fire activity has more than doubled from 2021 to 2023. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put a fact sheet into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
I understand that the R Street has connections to there have been representatives from insurance companies, nothing illegal or wrong about that. But what's being proposed is really, in the insurance area, something that is, I don't think, workable. I mean, Florida tried it and didn't work. The premiums are 2.5 times as high in Florida as they are in California. And, but there is a problem with insurance in California and across the United States that we don't have an answer to. And I would ask unanimous consent to put that information in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
I would just like to know, looking at the mountains in back of the fire in Altadena, you talk about forest. That wasn't a forest. It was chaparral, it was scrub. And one of the things that happens in California is we go from, the rivers to the drought. In 2023, Los Angeles County got 200% of average rainfall. I mean, it just soaked the place. And the vegetation took off. The next year, 2024, was the second driest year in history in LA County. So all that vegetation that got, spurred by the rain dried to a tinder. It was a tinderbox. One of the things that the fire chief told us when we visited last week is they want to do prescribed burns when it's wet. It's just about to rain because they don't want, in New Mexico, they had a conflagration because a prescribed burn took off. It hasn't done that kind of rain in LA except for this week from last April. I mean, there was no rain at all. They couldn't do a prescribed burn in those hillsides. They're too steep to do, to put bulldozers in. That's impossible. So I'm just wondering, Mr. Prevost, I mean, as a fire chief, what do you do in a situation like that? I mean, I grew up with the mission that only you can prevent forest fires, right? Smokey the Bear told us that, and we didn't realize when we did that we were building up this fuel load that needed to, I mean, it's a tinderbox. It needs to be removed, but it's going to take a while to sort through the accumulation of that fire. What do you do in a situation like in Altadena where you have that chaparral, it's dry as a tinder, and it's not wet, you can't burn it? What do you do, Mr. Prevost?
This is why I keep coming back to we need to rethink the problem. This is not a wildfire problem. When we have embers that will travel miles, fire breaks won't accomplish what you're looking for. We will have fires and ignitions in the conditions we have now long before any of the policy discussions we're going to have, the current ones we're having, are going to have an effect. We must as fast as possible, deal with the ignitability of the structures in these fire-dependent landscapes. If this is really about dropping losses of property and life in those settings, if that's what we're setting out to do, with laser focus, we have to mitigate those structures and do it at a density that will keep the structures from becoming the fuel type. You've heard it from everybody. Those conditions, you cannot stop the fire spread. Those conditions are going to get worse. They're not going to plateau. So this discussion about fire breaks and, and the idea of treating acres, millions of acres, we need to get there. But to your point, they're called prescribed fires for a reason. There's a prescription, which means there are parameters that you do them in. If you don't do them in the right way, you do have things like the Peshtigo fire or the Hermit's Peak fire. So we absolutely need to harden the structures first.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Baumgartner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the members of the committee and to our distinguished panelists here. I was able to visit the fires last week, saw that immense destruction. Also have some personal background here. My father was 40 years a professor of forestry. My uncle was a smoke jumper. My other uncle laid out more timber sales than anyone in Oregon history. And I worked 2 summers on fire science research teams. And frankly, we have way too much fuel load in our western forests, given 100 years of fire suppression. I'd like to get to the solutions. So I'm going to show a short video from some folks in Northeast Washington that can go in and do the kind of forest management that we need to reduce these fuel loads. This is from Vaughan Timber. What they do is they can take very small diameter trees and still get some value out of them and clean up the forest. So this is what the solution would look like if we could play the video.
Hello there. My name is Dwayne Vaughan with Vaughan Brothers Lumber in Colville, Washington. We are surrounded by the Colville National Forest here. We've been working on it for over 50 years. We're doing a lot of fuels reduction and thinning. We want to show that, how that works here and how it may show in other areas. And we really appreciate people that want to come up and see what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why it works, and what needs to be done yet to make it work even better or on a larger scale. We've got projects that are big up here called A to Z. We could handle more than double that, so we could thin more acres. Technology is the key here. If you had to do it by hand, it would take you a week to do an acre. With these machines, they can do 20 acres a day, which is economy of scale. And you got to have that critical mass because we have so many acres that need to be treated, even here, but on all forest in the West. So this fuels reduction work is very important to our forest, but all the forest. Unfortunately, quite the tragedy happened down in California with the LA fires. It's not necessarily forest like here, but it has fuel reductions that are needed, some forest treatments that are needed. We're showing you what we think will work in many, many places. So I will show and explain what this is all about. So we take a thick forest, we thin it out, we try to remove 50% of all fuels, if not more. Some forests have more than that, some a little less, but it takes incredible technology. And here, we're doing brush piling, but we're raking it up because you got a lot of fine fuels. And we put it in a pile where it dries, and later in the season, you burn it, and it burns very well. But this machine, we used to do it by hand, and it took forever. So now we have a brush rake on the front of that machine, and the guys are really good at it. Sometimes it's so steep we have to tie a cable on the machine to hold it as it goes down the hill and rakes all this. So he rakes coming and going, and they do a very good job. The piles are mostly woody debris, and they burn fast, they burn hot. But you can see it protects that fuel break from the rest of the forest, and we're going around various places of the forest to build all these fuel breaks. So again, the raking, the piling, and the burning is very, very critical. And fortunately, we have some value in this small material that it pays for the raking, the piling, and the burning, and also the road maintenance. So we think we're onto something that is going to lead us in the future to treat the acres that are available, need treated to protect our communities, make them healthy, make the forest healthy, gives us clean water, habitat, and clean air.
Thank you. So this is the solution that we need to implement in many of our forests in the western U.S. My question, perhaps Mr. Ring here, would be, what would it take for California to be able to implement these kind of common sense forest policies to rebalance our forests for a healthy forest?
Well, we'd have to bring back the timber industry. We'd have to have a way to bring back, for example, 130 mills were in California. You need to be about within 60 miles of a forest to have an economical mill, and we're down to 30 mills. So that's an example of something where there needs to be some revolving loan funds, for example, to help the timber industry get back up to speed. We need to allow logging in national forests, which is very hard. 57% of California's forests, marketable timber, is in national forests. We also have to recognize that private companies thin the forests far more efficiently. I talked with firefighters as well, Congressman Liu, and the firefighters that I talked with said that CAL FIRE typically has so many people on a job and does forest clearing with so many rules and command and control and so forth that they are about, well, he gave me an example, one of the firefighters, there was 28 people doing half the work that a three-man crew on an adjacent property was able to do from a private company.
Thank you, Mr. Ring. I'm going to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the statement from NAMIC without objection. We now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to be with you all today. Thank you for your testimony. On January 24th, President Trump announced that he wanted to dismantle FEMA, saying that, quote, "I think we're going to recommend that FEMA go away." Now, what FEMA does is helps people before, during, and after disasters. And they've got a track record of effectiveness. Now, Mr. Hilton, yes or no? Do you agree with President Trump that we should get rid of FEMA?
I don't think that question is relevant to this hearing, frankly.
Well,
we're talking about the role of over-regulation in leading to the wildfires.
Hold on, sir.
Not the response.
Hold on, sir.
So
I'm the one that asked the questions. Now,
so I'm responding by saying I don't think it's relevant to the hearing.
If you don't want to answer the question, that's something different, and I understand why you would not.
I just think we should focus our time
probably
on the
afraid
subject
to
of the
answer
hearing.
the question, but let me ask you, Mr. Ring, do you agree that FEMA should be eliminated?
Reform, not eliminate, no.
And what about you, Mr. Greenhut?
I don't have any opinion on FEMA. That's not why I'm here.
Okay. And, well, I understand why you wouldn't want to opine on it either. You're probably afraid also.
I'm not afraid. I just don't like to take opinions on things that I haven't
studied. You're not afraid of crossing Donald Trump?
I'm not here on a partisan basis.
I know that you
I'm not even a Republican.
Well, you know, you still don't want to cross swords with Donald Trump. I understand a lot of our witnesses feel the same way that you do, and for good reason. But now, let me ask you this question, Mr. Falt. You know, last week, in his esteemed wisdom, President Trump ordered the release of billions of gallons of water from 2 dams in the California Central Valley in a different basin than Los Angeles sits. And his reason was to enable Los Angeles to have more water to put out the fires. Now, neither of those dams would supply water to Los Angeles. Isn't that correct?
That is my understanding.
And there's no way to move water from one basin to the next. Correct?
That is my understanding.
And so instead of releasing water that goes to fight the fires in Los Angeles from San Francisco, those billions of gallons of water that President Trump ordered the Corps of Engineers to release just went to waste. Correct?
I do not know the final outcome of the water or the water system at that level.
It went on into the ocean, and the plan had been for that water to enable farmers in the Central Valley to be able to water their crops during the upcoming season of growth. Isn't that right?
I'm sorry, restate the last part of the question?
So in other words, the water that President Trump wasted, putting it in the Pacific Ocean, was meant for farmers in the Central Valley to use in this current growing season to water their crops, correct?
Would you like me to help you with this question, sir?
No.
Because I can give you the answers you're looking for.
I'm not interested in talking.
You're not interested in actual answers?
Since you are afraid to answer my questions.
I'm just about to answer your question if you'll let me.
I'm the one asking the questions. You're the one that should be answering them, but you've already refused to do so.
But you're not letting me.
I'm not asking you this one, though. Mr. Freevault, I'm talking to. Mr. Freevault.
He said he's not focused on it. I can help you with it if you'll only ask me.
Sir, if you would just be quiet, that would be helpful. Mr. Freevault?
I do not understand the operational benefit to the LA fires and the release of the water.
Yeah. It was a ridiculous decision and reckless and unhelpful. Mr. Freefault, you have 40 years of experience in the fire service. The other witnesses said that California's air quality regulations stopped the controlled burns that would have prevented the fires. But given Southern California's chaparral-dominated ecosystems, those kinds of controlled burns—
Gentleman's time has expired.
—would have actually put them at greater risk of uncontrolled fires. Isn't that correct?
Gentleman, time has expired.
So the chair is not going to afford me the same leeway that it has afforded other members of the panel to go over their time?
Witness can answer the question.
Thank you, sir.
I believe the question was, did the air quality management rules impede the ability to do prescribed fire? Is that the question?
Yeah, would those controlled burns have actually put the community at greater risk of uncontrolled fires?
Prescribed fires conducted outside of prescription can cause greater risk. Prescribed fires done within prescription can be a tremendous benefit.
All right, gentleman's time has expired. Recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you. I want to ask Mr. Greenhut, California's home insurance market is being held hostage by insurance commissioners and a judicial system that punishes insurers for attempting to price insurance based on risk. For example, in 2014, State Farm requested a rate increase of 6.9%, which was opposed by the insurance commissioner and an advocacy group. Initially, State Farm was told that instead of a rate increase, they were to retrospectively reduce rates by 7% and rebate their customers $100 million in excess premiums. After years of litigation, the courts ruled that State Farm didn't have to pay back the excessive premiums, but they were ordered to pay $2.2 million to the consumer group for their legal fees. And my understanding is this is allowing outside interveners, as it were, to challenge proposed insurance rate increases and being paid expenses for doing so. Is it reasonable to expect insurance companies to operate in an environment that required them to pay off their challengers even when they win in court?
Well, imagine this started in 2016 and it was resolved, a year or two ago. And so the whole system, and it was designed by the consumer organization, and they get paid, intervener fees for supposedly standing up for consumers. So that whole process took several years, and they imagine going, if you have a business and you propose a rate increase, and then the government says, no, you have to decrease rates by X amount, and then you get launched into this long court battle. And even after you win the court battle, which State Farm did, and it was a pretty strong verdict in their favor, they still had to pay these interveners around a couple $1 million. And now, under Prop 103, there are things that the state could do without going back to the initiative process to look more closely at how these interveners are paid and make sure that they contribute substantially to the process. A lot of this is languages in Prop 103. We need to enforce that language as it exists. So there are things that could be done about that intervener process without going back to the ballot.
It sounds like, once again, California way of thinking. But to that end, let me yield the remainder of my time to my colleague from California, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you very much. You know, one of the problems with making climate change the sole focus of these discussions is that it leads to a sense of fatalism, like there's nothing we can do, or it leads to measures that are absurdly misaligned to the nature of the problem. So, for example, in 2020, in the midst of the worst fire season of California history, just unimaginable suffering, the governor, Gavin Newsom, came up with a grand solution, which was to ban gas-powered cars. This is actually what he did. His reasoning was, look, the cars cause emissions, which cause climate change, which cause the fires, therefore we just need to ban the cars, and in fact, followed up with a ban on trucks, on trains, even on lawnmowers and leaf blowers. So, Mr. Ring, in your opinion, what is the more effective strategy when it comes to fire prevention? Is it banning cars and leaf blowers, or is it reducing fuel through things like prescribed burns and strategic tree removal?
Well, the answer to me is obvious. You're not going to have any sort of short-term impact, certainly, or even long-term impact if the rest of the world doesn't do the same thing with respect to whatever the theories may hold with respect to greenhouse gas and climate change. But what you can do is bring back logging, bring back grazing, and also mechanical thinning, which would be effective in the chaparral and on the steep hillsides. You can do mechanical thinning and you can do grazing. There's equipment that can do that nowadays, and of course grazing, they've been able to do that for millennia. So bringing back logging, thinning, grazing, and prescribed burns is the solution, and a lot of that can be done commercially, which would actually generate tax revenue and good jobs instead of costing hundreds of billions of dollars.
And by the way, which is more effective at reducing or limiting emissions? Those sort of fire prevention measures or banning certain consumer goods?
Well, I think banning consumer goods has almost no impact on emissions compared to being able to properly manage our forests and wildlands.
And in fact, wasn't there a study showing, and Mr. Greenhut, I think you can speak to this, that in the 2020 fires, the emissions that were let out there was twice as much as any savings California had for, what was it, the previous
16 years, so we're undermining any gains we're making in every wildfire.
That's right. I'll just close by pointing to an example that was brought up earlier. My district was hit by one of the most devastating fires in state history, where hundreds of people lost their homes in Grizzly Flats. And that fire might not have happened or been as severe as it had been if it had not been for delays through CEQA and NEPA with a forest management project that had dragged on for years and years and years. On the other hand, the fire was limited from going into South Tahoe because of the categorical exclusion that Mr. McClintock spoke of in the Christmas Valley. So you had the fire that might not have started if we'd done our job properly, but because we had this narrow form of relief, at least we're able to stop it from spreading even further. I think that is the recipe for how we can reform these policies and restore some common sense going forward. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes today's hearing. We thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials. For the record, without objection, the hearing is adjourned.